IronOverload.io hardcore. Episode 15. Steve here and Da Mobster joining me. What's up, buddy? We have another one on your way.
For me, it's one of those cycles I see lots of people doing, but as Steve and I just said in the pre-show, we're going to discuss whether it's the best, whether it's ideal, and of course, how to get the best out of it. As always, back to you, Steve.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. Today we're going to talk about Dianabol Dbol stacked with Winstrol, Winnie. And, right after that, Mobster pointed this on the pre-show. This is an interesting stack because Dbol is a wet compound. Winstrol is not just a dry compound, but it will dry you out on top of it. So It's one of those compounds you take and you really dry out big time. So nobody takes Dbol who doesn't have existing joint issues, and they're like, oh yeah, Dbol dried out my joints. Dbol made my joints worse. But Winstrol is one of those you take, and the opposite is true. It will dry your joints. It will cause some issues with your joints. So this is one of the classic yin and yang stacks where you're stacking two polar opposites. And a lot of people like to do that when they're stacking steroids. Some people like to stack two similar things together, and sometimes people like to stack the complete opposites and get the best of both worlds. So, in this one, we're going to kind of talk about the advantages and disadvantages. But first, why? Why do Dbol? Why do Winstrol? Why not just do testosterone and Winstrol? So a lot of people don't want to run testosterone and Winstrol. They don't want to inject. So Dbol, like testosterone, is a wet compound. It does aromatize into estrogen. It does cause water retention. So a lot of people will rather just avoid injectables. So let's say you like testosterone and Winstrol and you don't want to do an injectable this time. You want to keep the cycle shorter. Dianabol's got a very short ester. So you could run this stack 5-6 weeks max and get results. Running testosterone, a long ester testosterone, 5-6 weeks max, may not be you worth it at all, because it takes 5-6 weeks for the testosterone to even reach peak in the system, unless you're using testosterone propionate, which would take about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks at the most, to reach peak in the system. So again, but if you're using testosterone propionate, now the situation has become worse because now you're having to inject daily or every other day. So with Dbol, no injections. With Winstrol, no injections. So that's one of the advantages of going this route over Test and Winstrol. Mobster, what are some of the advantages, disadvantages you see versus running Test and Winstrol?
Well, I agree 100% with you, Steve, in terms of the injections. As you know, I'm not a big fan of jabbing myself, and the less I have to, the better. But obviously, one of the things that you and I talked about in the pre-show is I said that I've always been one of those guys, and I've said this on the forum, I plan what I'm going to do. I say, what's the best thing I can do? And especially if it's just an oral cycle, what's the best thing I can do for strength? What's the best thing I could do for size? What's the best thing I could do to cut, to get into shape and whatever else? So it's one of those situations, and I said this to you off air, I suspect sometimes this is the combination of the yin and the yang that you just mentioned. I also suspect it's one of those, sometimes a question of availability, in which case, guys, as you always know, we're going to talk about using sources to get exactly the right drug, the right combination for you. There is also going to be a personal preference thing here, Steve. And I think sometimes with the guys, they're going to say, you could even, there's loads of ways that we can run this, which we'll get into obviously shortly. You could even do, a 4-week Dbol and a 4-week Winstrol, bulk up and then cut. Again, any combination of drugs that we're going to talk about, guys, is always going to come down to the training and the diet in combination with the drugs. So and I actually said this to Steve as well, if Winstrol dries you out, and we know that it does, and especially as we'll get into the side effects with regards to dry joints, I actually said to Steve off air, I said, this is one of the few times that maybe running Dbol would actually have an advantage in that it would actually hold that water around the joint and soften some of that pain and discomfort. And of course, Steve, with any of this stuff, you can also look at dosages being manipulated. It isn't just straightforward, I'm going to do this amount of this and this amount of that. You could actually run a little bit of Dbol for that water retention I just talked about, and then a little bit more Winstrol to get drier. So there's a certain, I think I used the phrase online once, Steve, there's not magic in these things, but there should be some small degree of science, and it should make logical sense. So for something like this, I could see me, if I used it, instead of, for example, gaining perhaps just on the D-bowl cycle 10 pounds, of which a good deal, as you would know, Steve, would be water, I could see me doing something like 5 or 6 pounds on this cycle. And without too much water, and a little bit less moon face than normal. And of course, that's in combination with something like an AI, Novodex, whatever, to reduce that water as well. So yeah, it's an interesting cycle for me. It really is. For me, with my aims right now, I wouldn't do it. But I can understand that a lot of listeners looking to get into shape, and especially if their diet and training is on point, this could have something for them. Now, you've actually said that you run something like this. How did it feel when you were using it?
So the interesting about running these two together, if you run them at a good dose, not good as in a high dose, but if you get them at a good dose, you'll get just like a little bit of water retention, because the Winstrol is kind of gonna act as your AI in this. It's gonna dry you out. It's gonna act as your AI. So structurally, you're running basically it's like basically having a pool, and you got a hose running into the pool, right? That's spitting out a bunch of water, and then you got a vacuum on the other end that's taking out some water. So that's kind of like what's happening here. So water's going in the pool and water's coming out the pool at almost the same rate, to where you don't need an AI here, because they kind of offset each other. So I liked it. I liked it. I still enjoyed some hardening on this stack. It was a very, very good stack. What to me gets annoying, we talked about this in the first segment, Mobster, is the opposite of what you were saying. To me, taking orals once a day, twice a day for 5-6 weeks, that to me is more annoying than injecting. I'd rather inject once or twice a week, spend 5 minutes injecting once or twice a week, than have to remember to take my orals twice a day. It's annoying. So it works both ways on that. So don't think, oh yeah, I'm gonna do an oral cycle. It's gonna be easy. It's gonna be no problem. To me, it wasn't easy. It was a pain in the ass to stack an oral like this. And you've got to kind of remember to take them. You might miss a dose, or you might forget. Hey, did I take a dose today? Did I not? Yesterday, did I take a dose in the morning? I can't really remember. So, it kind of boils down to, it's much easier just to mark on your calendar once a week. Yeah, I got to inject this day. This way you won't forget. You're not going to forget an injection, but you're taking all your supplements, and then you're taking these. It's easy to forget. Did I take my supplement at 5 this morning, or did I take the steroids this morning? So you have to kind of organize it as well, and you kind of have to make sure that you're taking it. So that's kind of disadvantage and advantage too that we talked about earlier. But yeah,
let me jump back in here again for a second, here, Steve. So again, agree. There's no argument there whatsoever. Not personally an issue for me in terms of forgetting or not forgetting. I have my pills laid out, and there they are, and I take them. So it's not a problem for me. But yes, guys, if you're working in an office, if you're working in an environment where you should be taking 3 of these pills a day, and you're in a sort of situation where stopping for a moment just to pop a pill into your mouth halfway through the working day in a meeting, on a site somewhere, whatever, it's going to be kind of weird situation for you. The flip side of that, actually also get into with orals, of course, Steve, as you know, there's a certain degree of toxicity on the liver because, of course, of the processing by the body in order for the orals to be absorbed. The flip side of that, again, we've seen on the forums from time to time, and I completely understand this. And this is especially true, guys, if it's the first time you've ever pinned testosterone or whatever, the first time you give yourself an injection. I've been around a specific buddy that had a medical related form of diabetes. He was on a bunch of medication for the medical condition, and the diabetes was caused by the medication it was on. And he was very easy, very casual, freaking me out, sticking insulin into himself, no problem whatsoever. It was unlike, what the fuck? We've seen guys on the forum literally have anxiety attacks and kind of get nervous and fainty and nausea and all that kind of stuff, Steve, as you might remember, just from giving themselves an injection. And they're on there asking, is this normal and whatever else? And it's literally just doing something you've never done for the first time, with that association with needles, with the association with drugs, and people get a little bit freaky on that. Again, this is quite normal. The first time it gets easier as you go along, but some people suffer with that long term. Some people just really, really struggle. Now, if you're fortunate, get someone else to do it. I've done it for people, and it's an absolute piece of piss when I do it for other people. It's actually a bit of a struggle for me. I get used to it. I do it, but it's a struggle for me. So I can see the advantages and disadvantages of both sides. Guys, personal preference, issues for yourself, and if you're prepared, dealing with the potential side effects, it comes down to you. We can only recommend, we can only say advise, and then obviously at some point you make the decision as to what you do. There are always going to be advantages and disadvantages. Steve, back to you.
Just get into a little bit of the history about Dianabol. We haven't talked about that. And Dr. Ziegler, first distributor of Dbol to the U.S. Olympic athletes, he wanted to kind of get them more on par with the Russian Olympic athletes. The Russians were doping. The Russians had a doping program going on, and he wanted to hook up his own athletes. Now, back in these days, we're talking about the 60s here. What was the problem in the 60s was, doping and using injectables and having needles around. Very, very taboo. Very, very taboo, especially in the 50s and 60s. So any opportunity to get his athletes something they could just take as a pill would make a hell of a lot more sense. And then telling them, hey, you're going to inject this substance into your body. So I think that's a big, big deal. And that kind of was why Dbol became so popular. 70s, we know that the Olympians, not these types of Olympians, but the Olympians for bodybuilding and the bodybuilding competitors were heavy into Dbol. Dbol was their favorite compound. And even to this day, Mobster, Dbol remains the #1 most popular oral steroid.
Yeah.
So it's
any
still
steroid.
To this day.
Any.
It's cheap.
It was top 10 of both orals and injectables.
Yep.
It's a starter for so many of us.
Yep. And I know you like it.
Oh yeah.
I personally, I'm not a fan of it, but it doesn't fit any of my goals at this time for sure. But even back in the day, I didn't like it because I don't like that watery look. I don't like that smooth look. So for me, it didn't really help me. Even when I was strength training, I didn't like to strength train and feel bloated and get the moon face and all that stuff. So it's not for me, but a lot of people love it and it fits what they're looking for a lot. So really, Dbol, the past 70 years, probably the most used steroid of all time. And if you haven't used it yet, definitely use it. And one of the other things that Dbol does that no other steroid does that I've used, Mobster, is mood. It enhances your mood. It will actually make you a happier person. And it's not one of those steroids you take and you kind of turn into an asshole. So like the whole roid rage thing and the whole, oh, my boyfriend takes steroids and he's a prick on cycle. That doesn't really apply to Dbol. If you take Dbol, you should, I would say 95% of people who take Dbol improve their mood. And so give Dbol a shot if you haven't tried it. Yeah, very interesting compound, very cheap. That's one of the things about Dbol. That's why it's one of the most popular of all time, Mobster, is that it's cheap. And maybe that's not a big deal in America, the land of trust fund babies and the land of grandma gives me, $10,000 for Christmas. But in other countries around the world, maybe on your side of the pond where people don't have as much disposable income, it's Dbol. You can run an entire cycle of Dbol for less than $75, $100. So that's a big deal. So that's another reason why it's definitely one of the more popular steroids.
I'm going to agree in part with you there, Steve. One of the things that's funny enough with all steroids is there was a survey done some years ago, and I have no idea if this is still the case, but it certainly was at the time. There was a survey done of the kind of likely user in terms of most of them being educated beyond high school, the disposable income, you're not going out, there's not very little criminality associated, and so on and so forth. So you're quite correct with regards to disposable income for the buying of performance enhancing drugs, 100%. The other thing I was going to say in regards to Dbol itself, what I occasionally see, guys, and it's not, I won't call this a red flag, it's just that sometimes with this podcast, remember, we're trying to educate you, we're trying to give you the right information. And we talked about water retention. So some of you guys will be super lean. you're already dry. You like to see your abs, and then you're using this drug. Now, as Steve said, very true. Plenty of users talk about the feel-good factor that Steve talks about. But if you're psychologically built that way, what you will sometimes see is that little bit of water retention, and this is on Dbol on its own, which is where Winstrol will come in and help you with that. That little tiny bit of water retention that Steve saw that can blur the muscles. So you're used to having a pec delt tie visible. You're used to having a nice separation with your tricep and your bicep, and you're definitely used to seeing your abs. Dbol might not be for you. In terms of performance enhancement, Steve's quite correct. I've got a bunch of stuff going back over the history of the iron game, and specifically around York Barbell back in the day under Hoffman and Dr. Ziegler coming in and giving the guys the pills. And the drug taken was a bit of a thing at that particular time, Steve, in terms of recreationals with regards to weed and certain other pills. And they went a little bit crazy, I think, because they didn't have the experience to handle the idea of sensible dosages, etc., etc. And of course, they were very much performance related. They wanted to lift more, they wanted to win medals, and so on and so forth. But I think even Ziegler talks about the simple fact that he was giving them 5s and 10s and 15s, and the guys started taking 30s, 40s, 50 milligrams a day. So it was interesting. We obviously have a much better understanding now of what the best dosages are, how to use them, get an effective result, and cycle on and off. And of course, they had no idea about any of those things back then. You know, they didn't think about 8 weeks off, 16 weeks off, or anything like that. So yeah, there was the whole kind of situation at a particular time. But like I said, guys, if you are in shape and you like seeing your muscles pop, maybe Dbol isn't, but with that Winstrol, you will retain some degree of that leanness. And like I said, there's few guys, that's going to be the kind of thing that could mess with your head. How many times, Steve, have we seen guys that are bulking up suddenly realize that they've got too big, starting to hold water, starting to get that moon face, and immediately want to cut rather than finish the cycle, and vice versa? They're getting dry, but they lose their size, and it's a bit of a psychological battle back and forth. So
yeah,
Dbol would help with that a little bit, but the Winstrol, I think, would balance that out in this particular case.
We see this a lot because you see people follow people on Instagram. They follow these pros on Instagram. That's what pros do. Pros in the off season, they gain 20, 30 extra pounds. Then going into competition, they cut back down. And it's like it's a cycle for them. So they think, hey, those guys are doing it, I'm going to do it. Those guys, though, have top 0.1% genetics, though. So they could pull shit like that off. They could put their body through that hell and get away with it. They're going to shorten their life in the process, but they can get away with it. But you average Joe, you need to focus on year round looking the way you want to look, and not just, I'm going to go eat fast food and pizza and soda and gain all this crappy weight, and then let me cut back down because my favorite guy on Instagram posts pictures of all the crap food he eats and gets away with it. So don't follow what other people are doing. You need to do what works for you and what works for 99.9% of humans out there. Okay. You wouldn't give your dog or cat junk food, okay, for a couple months out of the year and say, oh yeah, it's the off season for them. Let me fatten them up. And then, I'm going to switch them to a healthier diet. No, you want them eating healthy year round. Okay. It shouldn't matter. So in this case, don't do that with your diet. Don't eat anything in your diet. We always want to give some diet tips, and that's my diet tips. But Mobster, follow up on that. But I also want to hear your recommendations for dosing this, because you've used a lot of Dbol in your life, and you've been around a long time. Have you noticed guys back when you first started use a lot more Dbol, a lot less Dbol than they are today?
On the first point, I was going to say, Steve, one of the things, it's one of those Mobster pieces of advice, and I had this told to me a very long time ago, probably way back at the beginning, so 40-something years ago. And it was in terms, and funny enough, it came from a pro. It came from a very high-end pro, but they were giving out sensible information for once. And the gist of it was thus: with a pro, you're talking about genetics. With an Instagram person, you're talking about the person whose essentially profession is to stay in shape. They stay in shape, they make a buck. They don't stay in shape, they lose money. So you have to have that in mind. You're an average Joe. You've got college, you've got work, you've got family, you've got all those other things going on. You're getting in shape for holidays and weddings, for gigs and whatever. You're not necessarily in shape year round. You're not getting a 6 or 7 figure income. So that's number one. Number two, this is the piece of advice from donkeys years ago, Stephen. Essentially, it was thus: look for someone, if you're going to mimic someone, who compares to you. So if, for example, you're a skinny ass, Look for someone who started skinny. Look for someone who has the same frame as you. Look for someone who's got similar genetics to you. And look for that person who improved over time and they now look how you want to look. My bone structure, I don't doubt for a second that my wrist is bigger than Stevesmi's. I don't doubt for a second that my aspirations in the gym, because we've discussed this multiple times, are different from Stevesmi's. So I would not do what Stevesmi does. I would listen to his knowledge, I would listen to his advice, but I wouldn't necessarily do what he does, because what he wants from the gym, what he wants from training is not what I want from the gym, not what I want from training. So that's solid ass advice. Right. With regards to dosages, Steve, funny enough, no. You and I know from the forums, from reading other stuff, from information that gets picked up over the years again, we've seen dosages, and again, it's just specific to Dbol, go as high as 100 milligrams a day. I would never do that. And the sensible advice back in the day has kind of come around full circle, Steve. On a daily basis, I would probably go maybe as high as 50 milligrams, same as I would for Anavar per day. But typically, I would run 30 to 40. And that's what they were doing 20, 30 years ago. Now, that especially works, and it's especially true when we're talking about combining it with Winstrol. So I wouldn't, for example, run 100 milligrams of Dbol a day, although some might. If I was running Winstrol at the same time, I would probably look to half that dose. And again, it's a total impact on your body and the perfect ratio and results for you specifically. So, for example, again, this is something I mentioned at the beginning, Steve. If you and I was running the same cycle, I might favor the Dbol over the Winstrol, whereas I could see you wanting to stay lean, wanting to keep your abs visible, favoring a slightly higher ratio of Winstrol over the Dbol. So but this is just, we're talking about 10, 15, 20 milligrams a day tweaking here, guys. We're not talking about crazy amounts and whatever else. And again, as always, my diet will be different from Steve's. My supplement intake will be different from Steve's. So we could both do something with this, I guarantee it. But like I said, historically speaking, Steve, I think we've actually come full circle. With Winstrol, I would probably be looking for the Dbol around 30 milligrams. What would you do, and what would you do specifically with the Winstrol to balance that off?
I would do something like I would do. It depends on how you react to Dbol. I would say like somewhere between 20 and 30, maybe closer to 20. I would lower the Dbol a little bit because you're stacking in the Winstrol with it. So I would do maybe 20 milligram Dbol, 25 milligram Winstrol, and see how you do. Do that for 5 weeks. And you should get really good results on that. If your gear is legitimately dosed, make sure you come on our forums, you get legitimate gear. I don't see why it wouldn't be an issue. So with Winstrol being a DHT derivative, dihydrotestosterone, it will not aromatize into estrogen. Dianabol does. So if you don't mind a little bit of water retention, you can raise the Dbol a little more up to 30 and then stick to 25 of the Winstrol. Now, here's why I wouldn't run a full dose of Dbol, full dose of Winstrol together. It's a very, very important topic, is liver. They're both 17 alpha alkylated. They both strain the liver significantly. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're running liver support alongside, but not at the same exact time you take them. You want to make sure you separate taking them and taking the liver support by at least an hour and a half. This way, the liver support doesn't interfere with any of the absorption of the actual oral steroids. So very important to run liver support on, very important not to drink alcohol, very important not to eat a lot of bad foods, which also strain all your organs and strain your body. So you want to make sure you take care of your liver. Normal on cycle to strain your liver, normal. This is why we make sure we cycle off, we give the chance a liver to cleanse itself out. You never want to run a cycle when you have existing liver issues or if you are an alcoholic. And I mean, very few people raise their hands are going to say, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. Let me put it this way. If you drink alcohol at least twice a week, you're an alcoholic. That's my definition. And that's the definition of many people out there.
So I'm screwed. I think something Steve and I have talked about in previous podcasts, and I would agree. I don't know necessarily I would agree with Steve's definition, a shot once or twice a week. But what I will say, and we see this, and guys, it tends to be you younger guys, and that's wanting to have a social life, but at the same time wanting to be in shape, wanting to get lean, wanting to get big, whatever. And again, as Steve quite properly says, you're talking about any kind of drug comes with side effects, whether it's aspirin, whether it's penicillin, whether it's paracetamol, ibuprofen, they've all got side effects, guys. The issue here is we having a social life. And what do I mean by that? Party weekends. You don't go to your pal's house with the pool party going on and with the girls running around and have one beer. You just don't, right? You might as well stay at home. If you're going to sit there drinking water, you might as well stay at home. If you're going to just sit there drinking some sort of soda, you might as well stay at home, because that's kind of situation. That's how it is when you're younger. So the reality of the situation is, Steve, I would agree with you. It's not ideal to drink at all on cycle, but some guys are going to have a shot. Some guys are going to have a beer. But what really happens, and what 9 times out of 10, this is the reason why this question comes up, they'll say something like, I'm doing this cycle, and I tell you about the cycle exactly like we're discussing today. And then they'll be talking about having a few beers at the weekend. And it's always that phrase, a few beers. And what do they really mean? 4 beers, 5 beers, 6 beers, Steve? Kegging. You know, that's kind of, and when you're 18, 19, 20, if you're on cycle, we recommend, as always, the age of 25 is much better. It's never 1 or 2 beers. It's always more. So it's kind of what we think of as the double whammy. And this is another thing, Steve, even without the stress on the system, why are you negating the work that you're putting in? Why are you going to a party, eating crap food, drinking crap beer, and then telling us you want to get in shape? That doesn't make any sense. You're not going to be the guy there with a bottle of water and a little bowl of pasta with some tuna in it mixed in and party. You're not, right? So don't tell me that you want to get in shape and spend 5-6 days a week working your ass off in the gym, cardio like a mad person, on point with your diet, on point with your performance enhancing drugs, including this particular cycle, and then going crazy at the weekend. That doesn't make any sense to me. It's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot. It's holding you back from the progress you could have made. Like I say with the cycle, Steve, there's always going to be another cycle, and there's always going to be another chance for a party, and there's going to be another chance to socialize and have a beer when you're not on cycle. So if for no other reason than to get the best of the money that you spent, $500, $600, $700, these two are quite reasonably cheap. So $500 for 6, 7, 8 weeks. Why waste that money? Why, as we would say here in the UK, why spunk it up the wall? No, stay on point. Get the best. You'll get the best results. If you want to get lean, you'll get leaner. If you want to get bigger, you will get bigger, because you stayed on point, because you did everything you could do to get the best out of the money that you spent, out of the work that you put in. Partying at the weekend, beering it up during the week, having beer and crisp and watching the TV in the night time and forgetting how much you drank and how much you had to eat. That's not the way to do these cycles. It's not the way to get the best out of what your original aim was. I'm quite strict in that particular regard. I know, Steve, is we once we're on cycle, once we're fasting, once we're on a diet, once we're in competition mode, that's kind of it. It's not quite living like a monk, but it's kind of close to it. And then that way we get the results that we want. And that's what you guys are listening to this podcast for, because you want those results. You want to be the best you possibly can. Let's talk about the training that we would do on this cycle, Steve. And I'm going to say now, we want that combination of some muscle size, but staying relatively lean. So let's look at the training that we do on this cycle.
So I think on both of these, Dbol, incredible pumps, Winstrol, incredible pumps. So I think if you really want to milk those pumps, I don't think you're going to stack these 2 steroids if you're anti-pumps. Some guys don't like the pumps the way they train, right? And I don't think you're going to run this in the first place. So how do we get the pump? We get the pump by really using proper form and really engaging and squeezing the muscle. And that's how we're going to get the best pump. So when I would do this training, it would be an optimal way of training. It would be ignore your friends, ignore the chick next to you or guy next to you that you're trying to impress. Oh, I'm going to load up a bunch of weight on the squat rack because I want to impress this person. Nobody cares, all right? Trust me, nobody freaking cares how much you're doing. Focus on lower weights and doing them properly and really squeezing. That's how you're going to get the most optimal workout here, and that's how you're going to get the pump. And you'll feel incredible getting the pumps. The Dbol pumps, there's nothing like them. There really isn't. And the same thing with Winstrol. Also, forget too much cardio on the stack because you're not going to be able to accomplish much cardio with all these pumps. So when it comes to cardio, you want to do it before your cycle starts. Don't wait till the cycle starts and try to catch up on your cardio. It's not going to work. Dbol pumps are legendary when it comes to your lower legs. My calves felt like they were going to explode using Dbol. So it's just out of the question to do cardio on this type of stack. And the Winstrol pumps won't even get me started when it comes to cardio. So you want to make sure you get yourself in top shape before you get on. And then when you're on cycle, do as much cardio as you can that you can be able to withstand the pumps. So one thing for the pumps, also another product in 2Guard, it does contain not only liver support, but it also has taurine. And that taurine will take the edge off your pumps. It's not going to get rid of your pumps completely. It'll just take the edge off your pumps so it won't interfere as much with your cardio and your training. So, Mobster, finish out the show with your final tips on training and take us to the disclaimer.
Right. Something else I was just thinking of, Stephen, is back to that pump thing. Now, as Steve says, they are legendary. And here's a tip if you do like the pumps. And as there is an argument, I've actually suggested that for the most part, the pump is not required to build muscle or build strength. But it does have a one trick in its armor that I will agree on. And that is what we call fascia stretching. So essentially, guys, and I'm thinking specifically in Milosarcev with the glycogen and manipulation and so on and so forth. Imagine doing that with Dbol, Steve, with some sign of carbs and water pre-workout to essentially feed the muscles, and then you do the Dbol pump, and your muscles swell and swell and swell. So the fascia stretching, guys, is where literally the sac, the membrane around the muscle, is what holds the fibers together. And sometimes that gets tight with scars, and sometimes it just gets full. And it's like you're never going to grow beyond that point. So here's a thing you can do. You do exactly what I suggest. You carb load. You make sure you get plenty of water during the workout. The Dbol pumps go crazy. They're thickening up the blood. They're pulling more oxygen in. And again, this is in combination with Winstrol as per this cycle. And you blow the fuck up. And that, as Steve said, can feel absolutely amazing. Sometimes it's too much, precisely for what Steve was just talking about. But the one time that I would do it, I would then stretch that muscle both before warming up, but afterwards to try and stretch the membrane, to try and stretch the fascia, and to try and allow for growth. So it has its occasional advantages, Steve. This is one of those cycles, guys. We're going to talk about a bunch of cycles both in the podcast we've already done and in the podcast to come. And as I said earlier on, pick out the one that best suits your aims. If it's about mass, this cycle. If it's about strength, that one. If it's about that small combination, if it's about recomping, we got you covered. This cycle was one of those ones I've seen come up again and again and again. That means there's plenty of you out there that like this kind of information, and that's what this podcast is all about. Please note, we are not doctors, and the opinions on these shows are ours and ours alone. It's our view and is based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast of informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.